I think that was his kid.
If there's no questions, let's get started. Come on, share the screen. That took a while to do. We can get rid of that. All right, if you look on the schedule, we're behind schedule. We are supposed to be beginning chapter 2. Actually, we're supposed to be in the middle of chapter 2. We're supposed to begin it on Tuesday. So we're a little behind schedule. I'm not terribly worried because I do have Tuesday, I'll be discussing chapter 2, but I'm going to try and go quickly through the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2 to try and make up for lost time. And today in the lab, we're doing lab 03 on the microscope. Any questions about any of that? Did anyone have any trouble with the Respondus lockdown browser when you did the practice quiz 00? All right, I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to assume that everything's okay with the lockdown browser. At least 50% of the time, there's no trouble with the lockdown browser. I think we've got 3 more slides to do. So about here. I'm not seeing the 2 here. So what was the last slide we covered? Anyone remember?
I feel like it was a 67 or 66 or close to it, like further maybe.
No, we weren't on 66 yet or 67. We're close to it. I remember that. I'm looking, oh, there it is right there. I just found where I put the 2 here. So we discussed 64, talking about the normal microbiota. The normal microbiota do not normally cause disease. Normally they live in symbiosis with us and usually do us benefit in one way or another. And the benefit may not be direct. However, under certain circumstances, they can cause disease. When they grow where they should not grow, or when they grow in numbers that they should not be at, meaning much above what they should be at. The normal microbiota can cause disease under certain circumstances. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later in the term, not today. We're going to talk briefly about, why is that in the way here? Let's see if I can scroll that down. Nope. We're going to talk briefly about infectious disease. This is a disease that a person gets that can spread from one patient to another. Results from a pathogen overcoming the host resistance, and it's caused by a pathogenic microbe, meaning all infectious diseases are caused by a pathogenic microbe or a microbe, one that causes disease. Now, sometimes we call them an infectious disease, but they don't spread from patient to patient. Most of the time, infectious diseases can spread from patient to patient. And we have a specific term for that. We'll learn it later. It's communicable. A communicable disease is one that spreads from one patient to another. Like botulism is considered an infectious disease, It is caused by a microbe, but when one patient gets it, it doesn't spread from that patient to another under normal circumstances. Any question about that? Can anyone think of a case where botulism would spread from one patient to another? Nobody can think of an example? What about if a cannibal were to eat someone who had botulism? Would the cannibal come down with botulism?
Yes.
Yes, but normally something like botulism is not spread from patient to patient because most of us aren't cannibals. I'm only going to talk about emerging infectious diseases. These are a new or changing disease that is increasing or has the potential to increase in incidence. And that's all you need to know about an emerging infectious disease. Can anyone tell me an emerging infectious disease? I'm not going to get that phone. You're just going to have to ignore the ringing. Okay. All right. Nobody can think of an example of an emerging infectious disease. One that's hitting us right now is COVID-19. Another that has the potential to increase in incidence, and people have been talking about it now for over 10 years, is the bird flu. If the bird flu ever changes so that it'll spread from people to people, it would become an emerging infectious disease. At the moment, the bird flu only spreads among birds. And although people can get it from birds, it doesn't really spread people to people. And hopefully it never will. But if it ever does, it will become an emerging infectious disease. Any question about emerging infectious diseases or anything else? All right, if no questions, I'm not going to talk about emerging infectious diseases. I'm not going to test you over it, but if you want to read about it or get more information, you can look at these slides. Okay? Any questions about that? All right, if not, that's it for chapter 1. What did I do to change that? I don't remember. Let's move on to chapter 2. I thought I had that open. There it is. Chapter 2. And that is really in the way there. Chemical something. Chemical properties. Chemical. I can't get that out of the way. Principles. Learn the major goals. These are only the major goals for the entire objectives that you have to learn. Let's see if it's here. Come and take a look at the study guide to chapter 2, and it's probably called the study notes for chapter 2, no, study guide. And it has all of the, the objectives to chapter 2. It'll have all of the objectives that you need to know. You should look at the objectives before the quizzes and then answer the objectives. They're not really written in question form, but you can change them into a question form and then answer it. And if you can answer the objectives, then you should do fairly well on the quizzes. All right, any question about that? And the study guide is what I'm going to be talking about, but it's in sentence format, not in a slide presentation. And the slides for chapter 1 are now available to you. All right, so the rough outline, know the terms with respect to the 4 biological molecules. be able to describe the relationships and the characteristics of the monomers to the polymers, describe the composition, structure, and function of all of the 4 major biological molecules, and give examples of each. What are the 4 major biological molecules? And if you need a hint, look at a cereal box and it'll give you 3 of the 4 major biological molecules, or any ingredient of food. Can you hold on a moment? Somebody's knocking on my door. Yes? I'm in class at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, I'm in class. Okay. Nobody's answered the question. What are the 4 major biological molecules? They're also called the molecules of life.
Well, there's like proteins and lipids, right?
Proteins, lipids, that's 2 of the 4.
Right.
Carbohydrate.
Carbohydrates. And then the 4th one you won't find on any ingredients of a food. You can find it in your cells though.
Is it nucleic acids?
Nucleic acids, there you go. Those are the 4 major biological molecules. You only find those in something that is alive or was once alive. Meaning if you find those molecules in the soil and there's no life around them, or in a rock, something like that, something that was once alive made those molecules. You do not find those molecules, for example, on the moon, because there's no life on the moon. Any questions about that? All right. So when talking about chemistry, it's important to know the scale of things. Let me see if I can blow this up. Wrong one. We'll look at this chart in the future. It's got a scale of 10 here, and it's saying that the smallest things that we're going to talk about are atoms. Atoms make up small molecules. Small molecules make up large molecules like lipids and proteins. Large molecules make up viruses. When you put, I guess, large molecules together, you can get cells, and the smallest cells are about the size of the largest viruses. And the average bacteria is 1 to 2 microns or micrometers. And then a eukaryotic cell is about 10 times that size. 10 to 100 micrometers. Although when you're talking about the largest eukaryotic cell, that would be an egg. And the largest cell you've ever seen is the yolk of a chicken egg. I know everybody's seen that. If there's anyone who's ever seen the yolk of a turkey egg or the yolk of an ostrich egg, that would be the largest cell on the planet, the yolk of an ostrich egg. I've never seen the yolk of an ostrich egg. Actually, I've never seen the yolk of a turkey egg. I have had students though have seen the yolk of a turkey egg. Above that would be, I don't know, an organism like a pig. And then above that, humans. And then I guess the largest thing would be a blue whale. You don't need to know the sizes of things. And let me warn you, right here, there's a mistake in this chart. That should be a millimeter, not a micrometer. Here's the micrometer. You only need to know the rank. So you should know a person is bigger than a chicken egg, which is bigger than a frog egg, which is bigger than a eukaryotic cell, which is bigger than a prokaryotic cell, which is bigger than a virus, which is bigger than large molecules like proteins, sorry. Why did I say protons? Proteins. And then that's larger than a small molecule like water, which is larger than atoms. Any question about any of that? And this is showing you that with the light microscope, we can see the smallest cells up to, I don't know, like a frog egg. And then you can go down much smaller with an electron microscope down to, I don't know, at least the small molecules, maybe an atom. And there is some overlap with the electron microscope and the light microscope. And then, of course, things that you can't see in the light microscope, we can look with the unaided eye, like we can see a chicken egg. Any question about that? All right. So when we're talking about the biological molecules, it's important to know that they belong to a group that we call the organic compounds. Organic compounds typically are complex. Typically, carbon binds them together, and carbon can do this, binding the organic compounds together, because carbon can bind to 4 other atoms. Organic compounds are held together mostly by covalent bonds. And organic compounds are more complex than inorganic compounds. So organic compounds always have carbon and always have hydrogen. They can have other elements. Inorganic compounds typically lack carbon, although they don't always lack carbon. Inorganic compounds are required by living organisms for their growth, their repair, their maintenance, and their reproduction. In fact, in you, the most common molecule is actually water, which is an inorganic compound. Some examples of inorganic compounds besides water include carbon dioxide and oxygen. And water is one of the most important molecules of life and one of the most abundant. Any questions about any of that? We will look at the organic compounds a little later in this lesson, hopefully today. But let's talk first about the inorganic compounds. Let's see if I can bring that up a little bit. We're going to talk about water, and this is going to be largely discussing what you'll have on your first worksheet for chapter 2. You might only have one worksheet for chapter 2. Water is a polar molecule. What is a polar molecule? It's a molecule that is partially charged on one end, wherever there's a hydrogen. It has a partially positive charge. And your book doesn't call it that. I forget what your book calls it. It's an unusual term that I don't use. Maybe it just says the hydrogen is charged. It's not a complete charge on the hydrogen of water. It's a partial charge, not a complete charge. If it was a full charge, you'd say +1. But this is a partial charge, and the oxygen is partially charged negative. What happens is the 2 electrons, which serve as the covalent bond between hydrogen and oxygen, they're not shared equally by hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen pulls on those electrons a little more, so the electrons spend more time around oxygen than they do around hydrogen. And that gives water the partially charged atoms, resulting in it being a polar molecule. Any question about that? Now, when we talk about polar molecules, we mean that the molecule has atoms which are partially charged, one negative, another positive. But when we say polar, we may also mean the molecule has a full charge, like sodium chloride in water, liquid water, will dissociate, and sodium will have a +1 charge, and chlorine will have a -1 charge. Strictly speaking, that should be called ionic because it has a full charge. But oftentimes when people are lazy, they will call it polar because it dissolves in water. And both ionic and polar molecules can dissolve in water. If something can dissolve in water, we call it hydrophilic, meaning water loving. Hydro, water, philic, love. Anyways, water is a polar molecule. The electrons are not shared equally. Oxygen pulls on those electrons more, so the oxygen has a partial negative charge, as the electrons spend more time with the oxygen than they do with the hydrogen. That makes the hydrogens partially positive charge. That allows water to hydrogen bond with other water molecules. A hydrogen bond is where there's an electromagnetic attraction between the negatively charged oxygen and the positively charged hydrogen. Remember, these are partially charged. And there will be an electrical attraction by that charge, creating the hydrogen bond. You should know that hydrogen bonds are weak and they break all the time, at least at room temperature or close to room temperature. And then they can reform all the time as well. When we're talking about water, remember that it has covalent bonds within the water molecule, but hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And we're talking about liquid water. So water has two chemical bonds, hydrogen bonds between water molecules, and then within the water molecule, a covalent bond, or actually two covalent bonds. Any question about any of that? What Totora calls it instead of a partial charge is a slight charge. Any questions? This hydrogen bond gives liquid water its properties. And that's why water moves and can change shape in the container it's in. It's because of that hydrogen bond breaking and then reforming. Does anybody know when water has a hydrogen bond between water molecules and that hydrogen bond does not break? Anybody know what that is? Nobody knows when the hydrogen bond between the water molecules doesn't break?
Is it surface tension or ice?
Ice is it. When you cool the temperature of the water down, you get solid water. And why the ice becomes a solid is because the hydrogen bonds form and the water doesn't have enough energy because it's cold to break that hydrogen bond. And then the water, instead of changing shape to fit its container, which is what liquid water does, its ice and water is ice, doesn't change its shape. All right, any question about any of that? Water is a good solvent. All polar molecules and ions dissolve in water. The reason is, let me blow this up, because water has partial charges, and the partial charge orients itself around like the fully positive charge of sodium, which is the green one right here, a full positive charge, that should be a +1. The water has a partial negative charge, and those partial negative charges will then surround the positive sodium. And that's why salt in a crystal, you put it in water, it will dissolve in water, because the water will come in here and then pull off the chloride on the ions and then surround it. And that's why we get salt water. And with chlorine, it's the same. It's just that the hydrogen ions orient themselves to the negatively charged chloride ion. And that's why water is a good solvent. If the molecule is polar, it'll dissolve in water because water will associate, come on, my mouse is dying. This is polar, so it'll be a partial positive charge here and maybe a partial negative charge here. The negatives will be, water will orient around the partial positive charge, and then the hydrogen of water will orient around the partially negative charge. For ions, it happens this way, where the +1 will be surrounded by the oxygens of water, and then a negatively charged ion will be surrounded by the hydrogens, the partially positive charge. So polar substances and ionic substances tend to dissociate in water and form solutes. Wherever you have something dissolved in water, we call that a solute. So the sodium ion is a solute. All right, any question about any of that? Water is a good solvent. The solvent is the liquid that dissolves the solute. And so when we put things in water, like salt, the salt is the solute, water is the solvent. Of course, you could use something like ethanol, in which case ethanol would be the solvent, and what you dissolve in the ethanol would be the solute. Any questions about that? I already mentioned this, polar molecules are hydrophilic, meaning water loving, that polar molecules and ions will dissolve in water. So we call those hydrophilic. Non-polar molecules are repelled by water, and we call them hydrophobic. This literally means fear of water, hydro. They do not dissolve in it. For example, if you put butter in water, it will not dissolve in water. If you put olive oil in water and then shake it, it'll be mixed just for, I don't know, a few seconds, and then it'll start separating. So oil does not dissolve in water, it's hydrophobic. Any examples of, any questions of that, about that? I already mentioned the hydrogen bonding between water molecules makes the liquid water. That hydrogen bond between water also makes water excellent at buffering the temperature. All molecules, when you heat them, will absorb the heat, and then that will cause the molecule to move more rapidly, and that will increase the temperature. What temperature is a measure of how fast the molecules are moving. And the higher the temperature, the more the molecules will move. Any question about that? Well, all molecules will do that, but liquid water, when we heat it, some of the energy will be taken by the molecules to speed up their movement, which will raise the temperature of the water. But some of the energy will be absorbed by the hydrogen bonds. To break those hydrogen bonds, where do I have a picture of that? To break that hydrogen bond takes energy. And so you give energy to liquid water, some of that energy is taken in by the hydrogen bond to break that hydrogen bond. And that is why water is good at buffering the temperature, because water can absorb heat to break the hydrogen bonds, and it can absorb heat to increase the speed of the water molecule. Only some things do that, such as water, meaning that they can take the energy in two different forms like water does. Most things like butter, something that's metallic, they can only absorb heat and speed up the molecules. So they are not good at buffering the temperature. When you give energy to 100 mils of liquid oil, all of that energy, or almost all of that energy, will be taken to increase the temperature of the liquid oil, and the molecules will move faster because of that. When you give the same amount of energy to water, some of that energy will be used to increase the speed of the water molecules, and that'll increase the temperature of the water. But some of the energy will be taken by the hydrogen bonds to break the hydrogen bonds. So when you give the same amount of energy to 100 mils of oil and 100 mils of water, you will increase the temperature of the oil more than you will increase the temperature of the water. And that is why we say water is excellent at buffering the temperature. And you guys should know that, because we live in Western Oregon or Western Washington, where the water of the Pacific Ocean buffers our temperature. And that's why the temperature doesn't vary as greatly in Western Washington and Oregon as it does in Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon. Because there's more water in the air and around us because we're closer to the Pacific Ocean. And if you're right on the Pacific Ocean, meaning on the coast, the temperature varies very little because of the buffering of water. Any question about that? All right. What happens when water takes the energy in the hydrogen bonds? If there's only one hydrogen bond, that molecule comes out of the liquid water and now will be steam. This one, you have to break 4 of the hydrogen bonds before this molecule will switch from liquid water to steam. Another reason why water is, well, I think I'm talking about that later, why water is good at cooling things is because the molecule which is the warmest water molecule is the one most likely to leave the water and evaporate. And that means it'll take off the most amount of heat, as opposed to a cooler water molecule, one that has less energy. So as hydrogen bonds are broken, water molecules break off and water evaporates. And as it evaporates, it takes heat away with it. And you guys actually are familiar with that. That is why we perspire, to cool us down when we are overheated. We perspire, and then the water evaporates to cool us. All right, any questions about any of that? Water can also split apart. Now, to split apart a water molecule, you need a lot of energy. And when water splits apart, I'm not talking about breaking a hydrogen bond, because that's still a water molecule that we call steam. When water splits apart, H2O splits into H plus and OH minus. And then the electron from this hydrogen is not kept by the hydrogen, it's joined to the OH, and that's why it's OH minus. So water, when it splits apart, breaks into a proton, an H plus, and then the hydroxide ion, the OH minus. The charged molecules can participate in chemical reactions, and this gives water its pH. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few seconds. So if water were to all being H2O, it would really have no pH, because pH is a measure of the H plus ions in the water. With the pH, you can have different levels of pH. The most acidic is a pH 0. And I don't know of anything that's actually pH 0. Battery acid is close to a pH 0. Stomach acid is between 1 and 3, usually 1 to 2. And that's when your stomach is pouring out acid. Usually the food will buffer some of that acid. Lemon juice around pH 2, grapefruit juice around pH 3, wine and tomato juice pH 4, milk, pure water around pH 7, human blood slightly above pH 7, seawater above pH 8, slightly above pH 8, milk of magnesia above pH 10. The strongest substance that you are aware of, bleach, is above pH 12. Oh, actually, I guess maybe oven cleaner, you're probably familiar with that, is a pH above pH 13. And then lime water is almost a pH 14. I'm not going to talk about lime water. So from pH 7, if it's something pH 7, it's neutral. At pH 7, the hydrogen ion concentration in the water equals the hydroxide OH minus concentration in the water. If the hydrogen ions are at higher concentration than the OH minus, then we have an acid, and the water will be positively charged, sorry. More hydrogen ions in the water than OH minus. Acid. For a basic solution, we have more OH minus in the water than H plus in the water. And so the water will have a negative charge. Any questions about that? As I stated, let me reiterate, the pH is a measure of the hydrogen ions in solution. The more hydrogen ions we have in solution, the greater the acidity. The fewer the hydrogen ions in solution, the more basic it'll be. And by the way, the term basic and alkaline mean the same thing. An acid is a substance that dissociates, giving up one or more hydrogen ions. Like HCl is an acid because when we put it in water, the HCl breaks into H plus ions and chloride minus ions. The H plus will increase then in the water because of the H plus from the HCl, and this is an acid. All acids give up one or more H plus. And there we have the picture of it. Now, a base is defined in the book as a substance that gives off OH minus. Like we have sodium hydroxide, we put it in water, the sodium hydroxide breaks into Na plus and OH minus. The book calls this a base. However, I'm going to tell you a base can also absorb hydrogen ions from the water. For example, sodium bicarbonate, which is called baking soda, when you put that in water, it will act as a base because the bicarbonate, HCO3 negative charge, can absorb the H plus in water, and that will decrease the H plus in water. And the H plus in the what is that? Hydrogen carbonate will form bicarbonate, the H2CO3. Okay. And if you don't know, H2CO3 and bicarbonate, and what's the other one? Hydrogen carbonate are buffers in our blood to help, and in our body to help us maintain our correct pH. This is one of the important buffers in our blood and our body. The point is, hydrogen carbonate can act as a base by absorbing hydrogen ions. And this is a case of a base that is not giving up an OH minus. Any question about that? So a base either disassociates, giving off OH minus, or it can absorb H plus ions. The salt is a substance that disassociates in water to form cations, that's a positively charged ion, and a negatively charged ion, which is called an anion. Neither of the cations or the anions can be H plus or OH minus to be called a salt. So sodium chloride, which all of us call table salt, is a salt, but so would magnesium chloride. It is a salt because it disassociates in water. Salts, or substances that dissociate into cations and anions, are called electrolytes. Electrolytes are substances that can conduct electricity. And that is why salt water is more of an electric concern than fresh water, because the salt water can conduct the electricity much greater than fresh water. For example, if you're in a lightning storm, you should not get into the ocean or a body of salt water, like the Great Salt Lake, because if the lightning were to hit the water, it would conduct the electricity throughout the water and into you. Whereas fresh water will be much less likely to conduct the electricity than salt water. So you should not be in salt water during a lightning storm. Fresh water, they probably tell you should get out of the water anyways, because usually there are a few electrolytes in the water that can conduct the lightning. Any question about that? Although I think the lightning has to be fairly close to you in fresh water, because I remember there was a lightning storm and people were playing golf, and it happened to hit near the golfers. Didn't hit the golfers directly, but because the ground was wet from the rain, the golfers got an electric charge, and I think they had to go to the hospital, but they recovered. They were the only ones injured. There was a whole bunch of people in the crowd watching, but they were further away from the lightning strike, so they were okay. Once again, that was fresh water, and rainwater is pretty fresh. There's not much electrolytes in rainwater. Don't know how much electrolytes would be in the grass when the rain hits it, but there had to be enough because the golfers suffered from the lightning. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on. Organisms need to maintain a fairly constant balance of cellular acids and bases to remain healthy. And as I stated, we have buffers in our body which do that. The most important one, and one of the most numerous, is bicarbonate and I don't know, like sodium bicarbonate, hydrogen bicarbonate. I guess that's called carbonic acid, so maybe that's bicarbonate. pH, as I mentioned, is the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution, and the pH is literally a measure of the hydrogen ions in concentration. When you take the hydrogen ions in concentration, that's what that stands for, the brackets on the hydrogen ion, and then take a negative log of that number, that is the pH. I'm sure that was terribly informative to you. The pH scale ranged from 0 to 14. And let me state that at pH 7, you have one hydrogen ion in 7 or 1 times 10 to the 7 water molecules. And that's what a pH 7 means. Did everybody get that? Let me see if I can do that directly. pH equal 7 means 1 hydrogen ion in 1 times 10 to the 7th, 7 water molecules. So that's not very many, is it? Yeah, let me get that higher. Superscript, how do I get that? There we go. A pH of 4 or any other number means that there's 1 hydrogen ion in, anyone guess? How many water molecules? Nobody's going to guess. It's 10 to the 4th. Oops, I lost the. superscript. There we go. Boy, that 4 looks smaller than that 7. I don't know why that's the case. And it's the same thing with pH 10, which is basic. Let's do 9. It's just easier. You got it. pH 9 is 1 hydrogen ion in 10 to the 9th water molecules. So that means normal water, when it has 1 times 10 to the 7th water molecules, one of them will break apart. And that will be why there's an H plus ion in 10 to the 7th water molecules. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on. Most organisms grow best between a pH of 6.5 to, actually that should be 7.5, meaning they do best around a normal pH. Any questions about anything so far? If not, let's talk about organic compounds. I mentioned we'd be doing that. This picture is showing you some organic compounds. As you can see, organic compounds are held together by carbon, or largely by carbon. Obviously, it's held together right there by oxygen, but mostly by carbon. Organic compounds also tend to have two, actually, they always have these two elements. They always have carbon, and they always have hydrogen. The carbon is the backbone of the molecule, holding the molecule together. And here we're looking at an organic compound in the ring form. Wherever there's a point in the ring, that's where there's a carbon. Any questions about that? Organic compounds can contain other elements besides carbon and hydrogen, unless they're a hydrocarbon, in which case they only contain hydrogen and carbon. But most organic compounds that are not hydrocarbons contain oxygen, although at less amount, and they can contain other elements. Oxygen is found, for example, in all amino acids, carbohydrates, nucleotides, lipids, and other molecules, biological molecules. Oxygen is found in most organic compounds, except for the hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons generally only have hydrogen and carbon. Carbon is special because it can bind to 4 other atoms. So organic compounds are held together by carbon, like this carbon here is binding to 4 other atoms. And as I stated, the carbon tends to hold the organic molecule together, meaning the backbone or the skeleton. Organic compounds can have a functional group attached to it. A functional group is some chemical combination that has different properties than an oxygen or a hydrogen. And then this functional group gives the molecule its special properties. For example, methane, which is carbon with 4 hydrogen attached to it, is a gas and does not dissolve in water. Methanol with CH3 and an OH group attached to it has different properties because of this functional group, OH being attached to it. And methanol can dissolve in water And methanol is not a gas, it's a liquid, at least at room temperature. Whenever OH is bound to something, we tend to call it an alcohol group. And if it's a simple molecule, it will, and you add it to a molecule, we'll call it an alcohol, like isopropanol, methanol, ethanol. Remember, functional groups influence the chemical behavior of the organic compound, and they're responsible for giving the organic compound its unique functional properties. So functional groups give chemical and physical properties to a particular organic compound or molecule. Hydroxyl group in alcohols give the molecule hydrophilic properties, meaning they dissolve in water. And that's why methanol will attract water and dissolve in water. You need to know the functional groups that are surrounded with a red box. So be familiar with these functional groups. Alcohol, which we've already discussed, it's found in lipids and carbohydrates, as well as proteins. It's not mentioned there. You need to know the amino group, and that's the NH2 or NH3 group. And this is found in amino acids and proteins. You need to know the carboxyl group, the CO with a double bond, OH, and that's usually called COOH. The carboxyl group is found in amino acids and proteins, in lipids, and organic acids. I should mention that some molecules will have more than one functional group in a single molecule. Like an amino acid has both the amino group on one end, the NH2, and the carboxyl group, the COOH group, on the other end of the amino acid. And then the phosphates, the last functional group you should know, the PO4 with 1 or 2 negative charges. This we call a phosphate. And phosphates are found in ATP, as well as DNA and RNA. Why do you think I want you to know the functional groups that are in a red box? You want to have a good idea? You get a hint from looking at the amino group and the carboxyl group. I want you to know these functional groups because they are important functional groups in biological molecules. Okay, any question about any of that? All right, with the organic compounds, the small organic molecules can combine into larger macromolecules. The small organic molecules may be called a monomer, meaning one unit. And then you can repeat the monomer to get the macromolecule, which we then call a polymer. So a polymer is consisting of many small repeating molecules called monomers. And most of the biological molecules, actually all of the biological molecules except for some of the lipids, are made up of monomers. So the polymer would be a protein, a carbohydrate, or a nucleic acid. And then the monomer will depend on the molecule we're talking about. For carbohydrates, the monomer would be a simple sugar. For proteins, that would be the polymer. It's made up of the monomers amino acids. And then for nucleic acids like DNA or RNA, it is made up of monomers that we call nucleotides. Any question about any of that? So organic compounds can be put together to make the larger molecule by dehydration synthesis, also called condensation reaction, where the biological molecule is R and has an OH group, combined with the monomer, the HR, and water comes off, so hydrogen comes off of this monomer and OH comes off of this molecule. And then we have a direct link between the two R groups, making the polymer. And then water is formed, what's called dehydration synthesis. So dehydration is a mechanism for synthesis of macromolecules, such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. The reverse is where you have the polymer, the RR group, and then you add water. The water breaks apart, hydrogen adds to one R, the OH from the water breaks off and joins the other R. And this is hydrolysis, where we split the polymer into a monomer, and usually that's a truncated polymer. You'd have to split it many times before you'd get all monomers. So dehydration, the mechanism of synthesis of macromolecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Hydrolysis, the breaking down of the polymer into smaller molecules. If you break it down all the way, you'd be into monomers. Any question about that? And something that might help you remember part of this is Marty McFly saying to his mother, "Ma, you sure know how to hydrate the pizza." And she was doing that by hydrolysis, changing the hockey puck structure into the beautiful pizza. Remember that? All right, showing you the dehydration synthesis in a little more detail, also called condensation reaction, where one monomer comes in to a growing polymer, a water comes off, so water is formed, and then the monomer is directly linked to the polymer. And then hydrolysis, where water comes in, splits the bond between this monomer and the rest of the polymer, and the water is split apart, hydrogen going to the polymer, and then the OH going to the monomer. All right, any questions about any of that? If not, let's move on to the carbohydrates. These include things like sugars, starch, and other complex carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are important as an energy source. Like for example, maybe if you're running in a marathon, they tell you a good thing to do is to eat a pasta or carb-rich diet for supplying energy. But carbohydrates are also used for structure, and they can be used to build up nucleic acids. You have to convert them into a nucleotide, but they can be used to make nucleic acids. And I don't think we're very good at doing that, but green plants can take sugar and then make nucleic acids out of it. Carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it's more than just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's of the general formula. For every carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And then you simply repeat that for the biological molecule. for glucose, for example, that's one I happen to know off the top of my head. Glucose will be this structure times 6. So the glucose is C6H12O6. Any question about that? If you take the simple sugars and string them together and link them together, you then get your complex carbohydrate. And that would be a polymer. I think all of the carbohydrates are polymers, at least the complex carbohydrates. We can separate the carbohydrates into 3 groups. The monosaccharides, they are consisting of a monomer, and that would be a simple sugar. The disaccharide, and that would be 2 sugar groups. Table sugar is a disaccharide composed of fructose and I'm losing it, glucose. And then the polysaccharide would be something like starch, which would be a monomer of a bunch of glucose hooked together. So we're just separating them into groups based on size. The monosaccharides are the simple sugars. All of them contain between 3 and 7 carbon atoms, but most sugars like glucose and fructose, and what would it be, pentose, are between 5 and 6 carbon atoms. Sugars, especially the simple sugars, are sweet and water-soluble molecules. The disaccharides are formed by joining 2 of the monosaccharides together. A disaccharide is sucrose, which is table sugar. Glucose right here and fructose right there, which is made by linking glucose and fructose together in a dehydration synthesis reaction, forming water. And then you can split, which our body does, by adding water to the sucrose. And then hydrogen joins to one monomer, which is the fructose, and the OH group binds to the other monomer, which is the glucose. Anyways, glucose and fructose are monosaccharides. Sucrose is a disaccharide. There's only 3 disaccharides we'll talk about at all in the class, and that is maltose, composed of 2 glucose, is a disaccharide, and lactose, which is composed of glucose and beta-galactose. Lactose is the sugar you find in milk. Maltose is the sugar you find in molasses. All right, let's move on. Actually, we're not going to move on. This is 11 minutes after. I'm going to end here and ask, are there any questions? If not, I'm going to end.
I have a question like about the tests and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Are the tests like all multiple choice or are they also essay?
A will be short answer. The most it would be, you need to answer with 2 sentences, but most of them are just a single word or a very short phrase.
Okay.
The A test will be that way. The B tests are multiple choice.
Okay. And is there a time limit on the one where you have to write in your sentences?
No,
Okay. All right. But there is a time limit on the one that we have multiple choice. Is that right?
multiple choice has a time limit.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I just wanted to clarify. I appreciate it.
Okay.